Knowing how big of a sci-fi fan you have been, I am wondering if you've ever read any works by Gene Wolfe. I know you must get referred to stuff all the time, but I can't help myself. My tastes seem to match yours pretty closely. Specifically, his Book of the New Sun series has so many snaky themes running through it, I get flabbergasted. And the most recent episode with Ben was no exception. You guys have given me a whole new way to appreciate my favorite book series of all time. From ancient tech to lost civilizations, layered symbolism, global cataclysms, rebirth, and compounded misunderstandings, cryptic religions, prophecies, and the blurred lines between high science and magic. The connections are seemingly endless. It is a truly masterful work, and I am fascinated with how the author had such deep knowledge of so many of these themes back in the 80s when it was written. Anyway, enough of my incessant babble. Love the show, guys. Keep up the good work, and check out that book series if you haven't yet, and have time for an epic that will consume your mind for months, years, or in my case, decades. Snacks! That doesn't ring a bell, Gene Wolfe, but that doesn't mean anything. I don't necessarily remember the names of all the sci-fi authors I've read, but I'll look into that and see if I've read anything by this person. Some of it sounds familiar. The name doesn't sound familiar, but some of this other stuff does sound familiar. So I'll take a look, man. Thank you very much. Appreciate the recommendation and glad you like the show. And yeah, I'm always looking for good sci-fi, that I haven't read, which is, there's not a lot of that out there anymore.
Not a lot of good sci-fi that Russ has not read.
All right, let's take a break.
Well, I want to mention this knife again. I've been playing with this knife in my hand ever since we opened the box. And dude, this is a very well built, well made knife, and it's Japan steel. So this is really awesome. So thank you again very much.
Japan steel. Does that mean if you should meet God on your journey, that God
will be cut? I have almost already cut myself. And the name
Fantastic.
of the knife is Spyderco.
Yeah. Spyderco or
Spyderco. Yeah.
Spyderco.
Spyderco. Cannot pronounce things on the podcast. Spyderco. Awesome.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
It's not a scarab beetle, I guess. It's a spider.
Yeah.
Looks like a scarab.
All right.
Just saying.
Yeah. It does kind of look like a scarab, but you're right. It's a spider. All right.
Now I feel really dumb. We'll be right back.
Snipes!
The evolution of mispronounced terms. Clearly visible on Brothers of the Serpent podcast. And yeah, we're jumping back into the book here.
Yep.
Hidden History of the Human Race.
Part 9.
Getting up there.
That's right.
Longest book report ever.
That's right. So yeah, last week we were still looking at the Piltdown Man evidence and the problems with it. And so we finished on the section where they were talking about the chemical analysis of the skull fragments versus the jaw fragments and the depth of the staining and the different processes that were being used to preserve the bones and how that may have changed certain tests. And the fact that the jaw had a surface stain, whereas the cranial fragments had the stain was all the way through, and this implies possibly that the cranial fragments are actually sourced from the Piltdown gravels, whereas the jaw was not. Okay, so we're continuing on with this part. So it says, if the skull fragments were native to the Piltdown gravels and were not artificially stained as suggested, then how is one to explain the gypsum or the calcium sulfate in the skull fragments? One possibility is that Dawson, and that would be the amateur who discovered these, the amateur who had good credentials and was a member of the Geological Association or something, and a friend of the the guy who was part of the Royal Society. So Dawson, one possibility is that Dawson used sulfate compounds along with or in addition to potassium dichromate while chemically treating the bones to harden them after their excavation, thus converting part of the bone's hydroxyapatite or apatite into gypsum. Another option is that the gypsum accumulated while the skull was still in the Piltdown gravels. The British Museum scientists claimed that the concentration of sulfates at Piltdown was too low for this to have happened, but M. Bowden observed that sulfates were present in the area's groundwater at 63 parts per million, and that the Piltdown gravel had a sulfate content of 3.9 milligrams per 100 grams. Admitting these concentrations were not high, Bowden said they could have been considerably higher in the past. We note that Oakley appealed to higher past concentrations of fluorine in groundwater to explain an abnormally high fluorine content for the Castanedolo human skeletons. Right. So this, in other words, what they're saying is this is not an uncommon argument. Significantly, the Piltdown jaw contained no gypsum. The fact that gypsum is present in all the skull fragments, but not in the jaw, is consistent with the hypothesis that the skull fragments were originally from the Piltdown gravel while the jaw was not. Chromium was present in the 5 skull fragments found by Dawson alone before he was joined by Woodward. Woodward was the guy who was in the Royal Society. This can be explained by the known fact that Dawson dipped the fragments in potassium dichromate to harden them after they were excavated. The additional skull fragments found by Dawson and Woodward together did not contain any chromium.
All right. Let me throw in something here.
Okay.
So this guy buys some potassium dichromate. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he has this stuff. I wonder how much it costs, and how many fragments of bone did he harden in this solution before dumping it out and replacing it? You know, I mean, that could be a question too. Did you always have to do it with a brand new solution?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's like purchased from a lab that's pure to some certain degree. I mean, I know from buying chemicals in the winery.
Yeah.
That
throw them out after you use them sometimes. Sometimes you just keep using them.
You keep using them, or you can buy from labs that aren't really as good as other labs, and so you will get less pure forms of it. So, but mainly the idea was that if I don't know if it's like, because we've used muriatic acid to work away some of the limestone stuff to kind of clean it up, and that stuff, once you've put a giant rock in this stuff, it basically neutralizes, right?
Yeah, and it neutralizes it. Yep.
So it's possible that you have to start with a brand new clean solution, but there's another possibility that maybe he just hardened multiple different things in his batch of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so it got, it picked up some of the chemicals that were in some of the other bones that he had put in there.
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so I had the idea, this may be wrong, but I had the idea that Dawson found 5 fragments by himself. And then Woodward comes along and they find some more fragments, and those get a different treatment. And then the jaw is found, and that's a different thing altogether.
Right.
And then the Jesuit guy finds a tooth,
Yeah. But so currently in this part of the story, it's looking like the jaw is not consistent with the gravels that it was found in, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. But the scientists at the time are wanting to say the skull is
Skull
not.
isn't, because it's too modern.
Yeah.
This is the thing, and we'll get into this later, but the thing about Piltdown Man is that morphology, if it was a real skull, in other words, with a modern-looking cranium, head, top of the head, versus a archaic-looking jaw, is the reverse of Pithecanthropus, which has the archaic-looking cranium and a modern-looking jaw.
Right.
Okay? So Woodward apparently was he was on the team that thought that the jaw was what should be archaic, whereas the top of the head, the rest of the head looked more modern. And that's what Piltdown Man was. Whereas Homo erectus / Pithecanthropus was the reverse of that. And so there were like these two camps looking for human evolutionary artifacts, missing links. Some of them were looking for heads that were modern with archaic jaws, and the others were looking for archaic heads with modern jaws. Okay? But yeah, you're right that the key here is that when they were calling this a hoax, they wanted the head to be the hoax.
Right.
Because it's too modern.
Yeah.
But it actually looks like the jaw is the part that doesn't belong.
Right. And so trying to match up those two things, right? A modern looking head with a archaic looking jaw and vice versa. Really what would really help this idea out in either case is if you had something that had teeth in both upper and lower jaws.
Yeah.
Because the teeth in the upper are part of the skull.
Yeah. Right.
And so if you could say, okay, we've got this very archaic looking jaw and this modern looking head, but the teeth in the upper and lower portions match.
Yeah.
In morphology, then you can say, yeah, this is most likely part of the same.
Yeah. And in these cases, and with the earliest Pithecanthropus find, the part of the skull that they find is basically eyebrows and above.
Yeah. They don't have any upper jaw stuff. Right. Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah. Okay, so the jaw did contain chromium, apparently resulting from an iron staining technique involving the use of an iron compound and potassium dichromate. To summarize, it may be that the skull was native to the Piltdown gravels and became thoroughly impregnated with iron over the course of a long period of time. During this same period of time, some of the calcium phosphate in the bone was transformed into calcium sulfate, or gypsum, by the action of sulfates in the gravel and groundwater. Some of the skull fragments were later soaked by Dawson in potassium dichromate, and this would account for the presence in them of chromium. The fragments found later by Dawson and Woodward together were not soaked in potassium dichromate and hence had no chromium. The jaw, on the other hand, was artificially iron-stained, resulting in only a superficial coloration. The staining technique involved the use of a chromium compound, which accounts for the presence of chromium in the jaw, but the staining technique did not produce any gypsum.
Wow. I was just thinking so if he's taking multiple specimens and hardening them in this solution from the Piltdown gravels, then that solution's gonna get the iron.
Yeah, that's right.
And so then if you take something that's more modern that didn't have the naturally embedded iron and then put it in that solution, it's going to get like a little coating
of superficial coating of iron. Yeah. Yep. Alternatively, if one accepts that the iron staining of the skull fragments as well as the jaw was accomplished by forgery, then one has to assume that the forger used 3 different staining techniques. 1, according to the British Museum scientists, the primary staining technique involved the use of an iron sulfate solution with potassium dichromate as an oxidizer, yielding gypsum as a byproduct. This would account for the presence of gypsum and chromium in the 5 iron-stained skull fragments first found by Dawson. 2, the 4 skull fragments found by Dawson and Woodward together contained gypsum but no chromium, so the staining technique in this case would not have employed potassium dichromate. And 3, the jaw, which contained chromium but no gypsum, must have been stained by a 3rd method that involved the use of iron and chromium compounds but did not produce gypsum. It's hard to see why a forger would have used so many methods when one would have sufficed. We must also wonder why the forger carelessly stained the jaw to a far lesser extent than the skull, which risks detection. Additional evidence in the form of eyewitness testimony suggests that the skull was in fact originally from the Piltdown gravels. The eyewitness was Mabel Kinward, daughter of Robert Kinward, the owner of Barkham Manor. On February 23, 1955, the Telegraph published a letter from Miss Kinward that contained this statement. One day, when they were digging in the unmoved gravel, one of the workmen saw what he called a coconut. Where'd you get the coconut? He broke it with his pick, kept one piece, and threw the rest away. Particularly significant was the testimony that the gravel was unmoved. So even Weiner himself wrote, "We cannot easily dismiss the story of the gravel diggers and their coconut as pure invention, a plausible tale put about to furnish an acceptable history for the pieces. Granting, then, the probability that the workmen did find a portion of skull, it is still conceivable that what they found was not the semi-fossil Eoanthropus, which is what they were calling Piltdown Man at the time, but some very recent and quite ordinary burial." Weiner suggested that the culprit whoever he may have been, could have then substituted treated skull pieces for the ones actually found. But if the workmen were dealing with a very recent and quite ordinary burial, then where were the rest of the bones of the corpse? In the end,